Now, the majority of people who say, I'm going to be a millionaire or I will be rich, most likely they won't. And I'll explain you why. Because they rely on a specific principle called motivation. And now let me explain, because you are probably confused, like, why is motivation like a marker for you to not be successful? And apparently, like, obviously when you're down or when you're depressed or sad, you'll probably search YouTube videos of motivation or reels or even TikTok videos, and I do that all the time, to be honest. But let me explain you from a conceptual understanding the issue with motivation. And the issue with motivation lies with the following, right? At least from a psychological perspective, motivation is an emotional state, right? And so if you learn classical psychology, then you understand that emotional state is not permanent. We'll just put X for not permanent. And so what that means is, it means that your emotional state can change. Suddenly you feel motivated, suddenly you feel demotivated, suddenly you're happy, angry, or sad. And so that is mainly because your brain is basically a big factory of chemicals, and evolutionarily speaking, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it, but what's the issue with motivation here, right? And so let's take a very specific example. You would like to be a content creator. You know, you want to be a TikToker, a Twitch streamer, a YouTuber, depending on, doesn't really matter what platform. The point is you want to be a content creator. And so I have experienced literally the same issue. So that's why I can explain from my perspective. So on my Instagram currently, I have around 40,000 followers, right? And I'm not saying this to flex or to, you know, make a statement or anything, but I'm here to prove the point that you probably watching this right now is thinking, wow, that is a lot, right? And exactly from a first principle speaking, that is the issue, because 40K followers is static, right? That is what you see when you go on my Instagram bio. That is what you see when you basically go on Instagram right now, search my name, that is what you're gonna find, right? But the issue was, it's motivation did not bring me there, right? It actually didn't bring me there. And I thought for a long time that I needed motivation to be a content creator or a TikToker or whatsoever. And so the issue is the algorithm, right? And I'll explain you in a second how that reflects to basically any aspects of your life. But on Instagram and most social platforms, you have something called an algorithm, right? Algorithm. And on social media platforms, this algorithm basically measures specific parameters such as consistency, quality of your posting, maybe your specific audio, the context of your videos. So there's a specific rules of parameters. Let's just call it rules, or in other words, parameters. And these will predict how successful your video or your content becomes, and in return, how many followers or how much your platform can essentially grow. And so, fundamentally speaking, I want you to imagine that society basically works on an algorithm, on a massive, complex algorithm, to the extent that I perhaps don't even understand most of it, but I can at least understand some of the basic principles, because I've applied and I'm currently applying some of them, and I want you to understand the same, right? And so the algorithm of society, right, is equivalent to what a lot of people call the matrix, right? You probably heard this from Luke Belmar or Andrew Tate or other content creators. And the matrix and the algorithm share the same fundamental architecture. In other words, the same machine, right? And so the matrix works very similarly like a video game, right? And same to a video game, you have sets of rules and parameters, right? And that is, you can already see the distinction here, parameters, is very similar to the algorithm on social media. And so the matrix, or in other words, this huge ball of complex algorithm, this is how society works. And to be frank with you, there is nothing much, at least from an individual level, that you can do about this. So in other words, you have to accept the way it works. And now you can further research and discover or even evaluate some of these specific elements that make up the matrix. But you can do that on your own time. But the point is, I want you to understand that this is the way the society rules, at least for the majority of societies nowadays, right? And again, there's probably like foundational reasons for it, like neo-Marxism, neoliberalism, and all these other political foundations that led to this. But the point is that to some extent we can all agree that this is the way it works. And so let's stick to the video game metaphor for a second, right? And so if this is a video game, you guys have probably played a lot of video games in your past. A popular game like GTA 5 is perhaps the most closest relation to how the society portrays the matrix. So let's take GTA 5 for example, okay? And so very similarly, like GTA 5 to the real world, you are the main character, right? I mean, that's at least what you want to be. It's all about you. It's about you creating the life that you want to. It's not about, other people in that nihilistic sense, but just bear with me for a moment now. Just understand that there is a main character and that is you, right? And so many people compare this video game analogy to stories, right? Or movies. And essentially it's all the same actually. And so you see stories and movies portrayed from other people through autobiographies. You see, for example, in the bookstore, in the library, autobiographies about Napoleon, Hitler, Mussolini, leaders, Donald Trump. Basically, a lot of these high influential people have a book at this time, right? And so the book is basically a specific projection, right? An abstracted projection of their life, right? So it's basically a life, right? Their specific autobiography is basically captured sequences over a specific time frame. And that will just make the story, in other words, a video game, and how they played within the matrix. And so let's go back to the very initial argument we make, the issue with motivation, right? And so if we stick to the content creation principle, I can tell you one thing for sure, and that's basically what I'm applying right now, is motivation, as I mentioned earlier, is not going to make you 40,000 followers or 100,000 or even 1,000, depending on how many you want. The reason is, and it's quite the opposite, is consistency. So fundamentally speaking, what is the difference here? Motivation is an emotional state. It comes, it goes. You can have 5 motivational moments a day, you can have 0 motivational moments a day. But consistency is different. Consistency is psychologically abstracted as stoicism. And a lot of people don't, I would say, really relate to this or understand this. But if you read literature from Marcus Aurelius, for example, you mention, or you can at least draw the correlation between these two. But Stoicism is a psychological approach, right? If we talk about the neuroscience of emotional state, is the psychological approach of consistency. And very often Stoicism is basically interrelated to discipline. It's literally almost the same thing, right? If you want to break it down, it's literally almost the same thing. And so what's the great thing about discipline? The amazing thing about discipline is, 1, you get consistency, and number 2, you actually play very well with the algorithm, because the algorithm actually measures consistency. And it's the same principle for the matrix or the current world or the universe we live in. If you want to become a millionaire or successful in the corporate world or whatever you want to achieve in your life, you will realize that consistency works. And that's mainly because it's one of the rules and parameters of society. That's just the way it is. There's no other shortcut to it. I can't elaborate or explain that even more, but just understand that for a moment, right? And so what I did was, I was like, you know what, specifically speaking about the content creation, I was like, you know what, screw it. I'm going to basically focus on consistency and make a 3-month plan of basically posting every single day. Every single day I posted one reel, literally. And for the past, it's been half a year already. It's been, I would say, 5-6 months. I was able to achieve this result, right? And so in first principle, right, or in a logical sequence, it makes sense because the algorithm is simple, right? There's specific rules and parameters, and 1x reel with that consistency is enough for the algorithm for me to get that result, right? And so the issue is, if you would like to reflect that to society, right? If you want to understand how the rules of society works so that you can be successful, it's not that simple as the algorithm for social media, right? The specific parameters for you to become a millionaire is highly complex. It's absolutely difficult, right? And it's for those reasons why for example, haven't reached that stage yet. But I know what it takes, I know what the rules and parameters are to get there, right? To be, let's put it right here, to be a millionaire, for example, right? So if you would like to become that, you have to understand what it takes to reach that stage. And you can do that by, one, as I mentioned earlier, stories and movies, and just learning how other people did it. And this is why the consumption of knowledge is crazy, crazy high. Wait, let me just check if I'm recording. Yeah, okay. That's why the consumption of knowledge is super, super high. And this is why you always hear cliche phrases like never stop learning, or it's just to never stop learning. Stop learning. Or trust the process. You hear that literally everywhere. I think every rapper or like athlete, super athlete in America, they always say that, trust the process. I do apologize for my writing. But the point is, to be a millionaire, it's a highly complex algorithm. But it's not impossible. It's not impossible. But one thing to understand is the way the algorithm works, it doesn't rely on motivation, right? And so that is basically the introduction of the video, because I mentioned that if you rely on motivation to become a millionaire, it's simply not going to work. Because it's fundamentally speaking quite opposite to how the algorithm works, how the matrix and the paradigms of society work. They don't rely on motivation. They rely on a numerous sets of factors, and one of them is consistency. Consistency is a huge one, right? Consistency is yielded from, where is it, discipline. I think we wrote it out right here, discipline. And so in order to be consistent, you have to start with discipline, right? And so just a general rule, once you see these principles, always find the underlying first principles out of it, right? So you would, for example, want to achieve consistency. Okay, consistency is a psychological abstraction of Stoicism. Stoicism is no other, or other, metaphorically speaking, other symbols of discipline. And so then you can further elaborate this and investigate this and figure out, okay, what does discipline mean? Like, do I have to restrict my dopamine levels? Do I need to, understand gratitude? And that research you can do for yourself. It's not enough for me to elaborate in this video, but you can, for example, figure out what discipline means, right? And so, in a nutshell, this is basically the architecture of society. Or in other words, the architecture of the universe. It works on certain rules of principles, certain rules of parameters, and the most important and the first thing you have to understand is that the parameters work on specific rule sets. And so once you understand the rules of the game, you can be a crazy good player. Just like GTA 5 or just like FIFA or any type of video games you guys like to play, if you understand how the rules work and you use them quite well to your advantage, you're going to win the game eventually. And so there are obviously cheaters out there, people who find shortcuts, and sometimes it works, these shortcuts, but in my opinion it's not a sustainable strategy for the long run. And so with that being said, goodbye.